So in this lesson we're going to be moving on to the refining step for just the face. We're going to go from this, which was our previous step, to this. Now I'm going to be speeding a lot of this up, but you should know that this refining stage took me about an hour. So you shouldn't spend any more than about twice that on yours. Alright, so let's make a new layer, and we will call it refining or refinements, and then we'll make it a clipping mask. If you're curious about how I got the reference picture to float in the left corner there, I did make a video specifically on that, so go watch that now so you can have your reference picture wherever you need it to be. We're going to zoom in now. On the refining stage, remember, we're zooming in to work on details. This is where we start blending our shadows and highlights together. You can see there's lots of rough edges on mine at the moment. And we also start working with a smaller brush. We've zoomed in so that we can get some of the finer details. One thing I'd suggest is always using the largest brush you can. If you use a small brush to cover a large area, you're guaranteed to get a lot of streaky lines. If you can use a larger brush, then that won't happen. So although you do have to get a smaller brush sometimes to get into the small areas, don't go smaller than you need to. I should really be using a soft-edged brush here. I didn't notice that my brush was set to a hard edge, which made some of the blending more difficult. You only want a hard-edged brush when you're painting along edges that are supposed to be very sharp. Whenever you're trying to blend values, make sure your brush is soft. You'll notice that I'm still not doing the eye in complete detail at this point. I haven't put in the pupils, we haven't drawn in any eyelashes or things like that. Any details that would be really hard to paint around, like it would be very hard to paint around individual eyelashes, for example, we're going to leave those details for another layer near the end of the process. That layer will have both thin lines that we want to protect and things that need very sharp edges like the pupil and the iris. A good way to think about it is any details that would be lost if you were to add a slight blur to the image. Don't paint them yet. Save them for that detail layer. So you should constantly be looking at your reference picture during this stage and trying to get your values as accurate to that reference as possible. You notice that I'm not zooming in very much during this part of the process. I'm just moving from one area of the face to the next. It's a good idea to stay at a certain level of detail until you've done the entire face, instead of zooming in just on one part of the face and doing tons and tons of work there. That way the face develops sort of as one unit rather than one piece at a time. So we will zoom in, but don't do too much of it yet at this stage. Don't forget to save your work regularly, but don't overwrite the previous file. The refinement stage is going to be saved as a separate file so that you can add your work in progress shots to your Sparks page. So some areas of the face are more detailed than others, and at this stage, now that I've gone over the entire face once, I'm going to start zooming in on areas that need a little more attention, like the nose and the mouth and the eyes. Those are the places that tend to be the most complicated. This was the point I realized I was blending with a hard-edged brush and changed it to a soft one. Again, a soft-edged brush for blending will really make things easier. You want to turn your line art layer on and off occasionally just so that you can see places where you might need to add a little bit more definition. When the lines are still in there, your eye will interpret them as edges. You can see areas like the jawline here, which it needs to be more defined. So if you remember, I said earlier we'd be making a layer for even finer details, either things that have to have really hard edges, like a pupil or an iris, or things that would be very difficult to paint around, like eyelashes or really sharp creases in the eyelids. So for those, we're going to create a new layer, and we're going to call this layer Details. And when you're painting very thin lines or sharp edges, you don't want to have to paint over the same area multiple times. So we're going to put the opacity up to about 80 or 90%, and we're going to switch to a hard-edged brush. There's one other thing we need to do. You'll notice that the line art is a little hard to see now, especially around the eyes. So we're actually going to change how it looks so that we can see it. First, we're going to click the Lock Transparent Pixels icon at the top. It looks like a little checkerboard with a lock on the corner. This will mean that we can only paint on the areas that have already been painted on. Then you can pick a light color. I would recommend sort of a light tan color. And with a really big brush, just paint all over the face. And what this will do is paint that light tan color over top of the lines in the line art. Make sure you change the blend mode from multiply to normal, or you won't see any difference. So now on this layer, you're going to start putting in all the hard edges and fine details. For example, the iris of the eye, you want that to have a very sharp edge. You don't want a fuzzy looking iris. So with a hard-edged brush, we're going to go over that edge to make it nice and sharp. The same thing with the pupil. You want the pupil to have a nice, crisp, sharp edge. Actually, a trick that you could use for the pupil is just to resize your brush so it's the right size. Just click once with the opacity set to 100% and erase the top part, erase the part that sticks up over the eyelid. It's easy to fall into a trap in this stage where you can see your line art and you are on the detail layer where you're meant to put some of the dark, clear lines, and so you might just start drawing over all the lines of your line art. But don't do that. Remember, your line art is just there to tell you where things are. Only draw lines if you see lines on your reference picture. So there is a dark line along the top of the eye, so we're going to draw that in, but there's not a dark line along the bottom of the eye, as an example. So don't be tempted to put one there. Another thing you need to avoid is don't do any blending on this layer. You might notice, for example, that your eyelid is too bright and then you decide to blend it and make it a little bit darker. But the problem is that's now stuck on your detail layer. So if you go back to work on the eyelid on your refinement layer and try to blend things together, you won't be able to do it because that darkening you did is on the layer above. The only things that should go on the detail layer are things that you don't want to blend. Sharp lines, crisp edges, and texture. I've put a little bit of texture into the eye here, and I don't want to blend that. This is also the layer where you want to put your highlights because you want the highlights to be nice and bright. They should be nearly pure white. Most eyes have a sharp line above the eyelid where the crease is, so I'm going to put those in next. Now at this point, just like I mentioned a minute ago, I noticed that the eyelid was too bright on that eye. So I switched back to my refinement layer to blend in some more darker values there. So again, remember to not do things on the detail layers that aren't actually crisp details. It's really easy to forget. I still do it all the time. But try to keep reminding yourself because it will save you a lot of headaches. Now, although there's not a dark line at the bottom of the eye, if you look closely at the reference picture, you'll see that there is a very light line caused by the edge of the eyelid. So we're going to draw that in next. So whenever I'm working on blending the whites of the eye, I switch back to the refinement layer and blend things there. The positive about that is that I don't have to worry about overlapping the edge of the iris. I can paint without being too careful near that because the edge of the iris and the edge of the rest of the eye is on the detail layer, so I can't overlap it. So once again, we're back to the detail layer, and now we're going to add some texture to the eyebrows. If you look at your reference picture, you'll see that, especially on the left-hand one, you can see a lot of hair texture there. So we're going to just draw some in, but don't get too worried about trying to match every specific hair at this stage. You just want to get the sense that there is a hair texture there. So now we're moving on to the eyelashes, and I'm making a new layer for these. I find it's a good idea to make a new layer anytime you're working on something that is particularly challenging, because if it's on a layer by itself, it's very easy to erase it without affecting anything else. If I put these on the detail layer and then decided that I didn't like a couple that I'd made, well, they're already overlapping some of the other lines at that point, which would make them much more difficult to erase.